The first thing that struck me when I pushed open the front door was how quiet the kookaburras were. Normally at 3:30 in the afternoon, you'd hear them carrying on something fierce in the gum trees behind the back fence. But that day, when the taxi dropped me off at the curb of the only house I'd lived in since 1987, the birds were gone. Or maybe they were there and I just couldn't hear them over the strangeness of everything else. I'd been away for 19 days. 8 in Royal Brisbane Hospital after my hip replacement, and then another 11 recovering at my younger sister Hazel's place in Toowoomba. Hazel is 68, 2 years younger than me, and she drove the 2.5 hours down the range to collect me from the hospital ward without my even having to phone her twice. She'd made up the spare room with fresh linen and stocked the fridge with the kind of food a man with a new hip can manage on his own. Lamb stew, shepherd's pie, apple crumble that her late husband used to swear by. That's the kind of woman my sister is, and I mention her now because she matters more in this story than I realized at the time. My son-in-law did not collect me from the hospital. My daughter rang the day before to say he was flat out with work commitments, and that they'd both make it up to me when I got back. I told her not to worry. I caught a taxi down to Toowoomba on my own dime. Then Hazel drove me home 11 days later, helped me up the front steps, and waved off any suggestion of staying for tea. She had her own family to get back to. She kissed me on the forehead the way our mum used to and told me to ring if I needed anything at all. So when I stepped through my front door at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, I was alone. Or I thought I was alone. The first thing I noticed, after the missing kookaburras, was the smell. Not unpleasant, exactly, but unfamiliar. A sort of synthetic floral scent that didn't belong anywhere in my house. Underneath it, fainter, the smell of cigarette smoke that someone had tried to mask. I haven't allowed smoking inside this house since 1992, when my late wife Eleanor first started chemotherapy and the doctor said she needed clean air. That rule outlasted her by 23 years. The hallway light was on. The kitchen light was on. It was the middle of a sunny autumn afternoon, and the western windows were doing their job. But every electric light in the front of the house was burning. I set my overnight bag down beside the hall stand. I called out hello, more out of habit than expectation, because my daughter would be at work. And her husband, well, his work patterns had been a bit of a mystery to me for the better part of 3 years. There was no answer. I made my way slowly, because of the hip, down the central hallway towards the room I've kept as my study since the year my daughter started high school. It's not a grand room, about 3.5 meters square. One window that looks out over Eleanor's old herb garden, and walls lined with books that the two of us collected over 38 years of marriage. Eleanor's reading chair sits in the corner. It's a wingback, upholstered in a faded green chintz that used to be much brighter, and it has a permanent dip in the seat cushion from where she used to sit, with her feet tucked under her, marking student essays. She was an English teacher at the local high school for 29 years. The chair was the first piece of furniture we bought together as newlyweds in 1972, second-hand from an estate sale in Paddington. The study door was locked, not jammed, not stuck from the humidity that sometimes builds up in a Brisbane house at the end of autumn. Locked, with a brass deadbolt I had never laid eyes on before, fitted at chest height into the doorframe with the kind of clean, precise installation that tells you somebody took their time with a chisel and a measuring tape. I stood there in the hallway with my hand resting on the wall for balance, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger yet. Something quieter than anger. The way you might feel if you came home and found a stranger sitting at your kitchen table eating your toast. Bewilderment. Maybe. With a hard edge underneath it. I knocked. I felt foolish, knocking on the door of a room I'd been working in for 33 years. But I knocked. There was no answer. I knocked again. Harder. Still nothing. I went looking for my son-in-law. His car had been in the driveway when I came up the path, parked behind my old Falcon, and I found him eventually in the rumpus room down the back of the house. He was sitting on the leather lounge I'd bought after Eleanor died, watching something on a laptop with a pair of wireless headphones clamped over his ears. He didn't see me come in. I stood in the doorway for the better part of a minute before he glanced up, pulled one earpiece off and said, "Oh, you're home. Not welcome back. Not how was the trip. Not how's the hip. Just an observation. Almost mildly inconvenienced. Like a man noting that the postie had come early." I asked him why my study door was locked. He took a moment to set the laptop on the side table. He folded the headphones into his lap. Then he told me, in the same flat tone, that his mother had needed somewhere to stay for a while and that they'd thought it would make sense to use the study since I wasn't home anyway. He said my things had been moved into the garage. He said his mother needed her privacy, and so he'd put a lock on the door. I want to be honest about what was going on inside my head while he was speaking, because what I did next depended on it. I was not, in that moment, especially angry. I was something colder than angry. I was the way a man feels when he realizes that a stranger has been wearing his clothes while he was out of the house. I felt distant from the situation, as if I were watching it happen to somebody else through a window. I asked him when he'd been planning on telling me. He said they'd thought it would be easier to explain everything once I was home and could see for myself how well it was working out. I asked him who'd installed the deadbolt. He said he had. He said his mother needed to feel secure. I nodded. I didn't say anything else. I turned around and walked back up the hallway, slowly because of the hip, and I went and sat at the kitchen table. I looked out the window over the sink at the jacaranda tree in the side garden, the one Eleanor and I planted the weekend our daughter turned 3. It was just starting to drop the last of its leaves. I sat there, and I thought very carefully about the kind of man I was going to be over the course of the next few hours, and the next few days, and possibly the next few months. Let me give you some background. My daughter's name is Imogen. She's 36. She's a primary school teacher at the same school her mother taught at for nearly 3 decades, which I always thought was a lovely bit of continuity. She has Eleanor's same dark eyes, and for most of her life, her mother's same gentleness with people. I say most of her life because what I came to learn over the next few weeks adjusted some of what I thought I knew about my daughter, and that's been one of the harder parts to make peace with. My son-in-law's name is Brennan. He's 39. He grew up on the Sunshine Coast, has a sister somewhere in Perth, and a mother named Patricia. I'd met Patricia perhaps 4 times in the 7 years since they'd been married, mostly at family birthdays and once at the wedding itself. She struck me as a woman who watched everyone in a room very carefully, without saying much. I hadn't formed strong opinions about her one way or the other. I had no reason to before that Tuesday afternoon. When Imogen got home from school just after 4, I was still sitting at the kitchen table. She came through the side door from the carport, saw me, and stopped. Her face went through several expressions in a very short period of time. "Dad," she said, "how was the trip down?" I told her the trip had been fine. I told her Hazel sent her love. I told her to sit down because we needed to have a conversation. She sat. She put her keys on the table between us, very carefully, the way you'd put down something fragile. She didn't look at me. She told me she knew I was going to be upset. She said she'd been meaning to ring me about it, but Patricia's situation had moved very quickly, and they'd had to make a call, and that once I'd had a chance to meet Patricia properly and see how lovely she was being and how she was helping out around the house, I'd come round to the idea. I asked her when, exactly, this decision had been made. She said, about 3 weeks ago. I asked her what date my hip surgery had been scheduled for. She didn't answer that immediately. She knew the answer. She'd had it written on her kitchen calendar for 4 months. I asked her again, gently, when the decision had been made. She said it had been the day after I checked into hospital. I sat with that for a moment. I felt the cold thing in my chest get a little colder. I asked her why nobody had picked up a phone. I'd been at Hazel's for 11 days. I'd had a phone with full reception. I'd spoken to her twice during that period, both times at her instigation, and during neither conversation had she mentioned anything about her mother-in-law moving into my house. She said she hadn't wanted to put pressure on my recovery. I asked her whether she thought a deadbolt on the study door was less pressure than a phone call. She didn't have an answer for that one. She started to cry, the quiet kind of crying that people do when they're hoping it will end the conversation. I told her I loved her. I told her that hadn't changed and wasn't going to. Then I told her that I needed her to remove the deadbolt from the study door before I went to bed that night, and that we would talk again in the morning when we both had clearer heads. She nodded. She took her keys and went down the hallway to talk to Brennan. I went to bed early that night. I didn't sleep. I lay in the room I'd shared with Eleanor for 38 years, staring at the ceiling, and I turned the situation over and over in my mind. The thing that kept coming back to me was the timing. My surgery had been booked since the previous spring. They'd had 4 months' notice. The decision to bring Patricia in had been made, by their own admission, the day after I went under the anesthetic. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a plan that depended on me being unavailable, unconscious, and far enough away that by the time I got home, the situation would already be, as the lawyers say, a fait accompli. I worked in conveyancing for 41 years before I retired. I know what it looks like when people are hoping you won't read the fine print. The next morning I was up before 6. I made coffee in my own kitchen, with my own beans. And I waited. Patricia came downstairs at about 7, wearing a dressing gown that I recognized as one Eleanor had bought for our daughter 20 years ago, and which had been in the linen cupboard ever since. She opened my fridge. She looked through it for a minute. Then she turned around and saw me sitting at the table, and her face did a small, controlled flicker before she smiled. "You must be Imogen's father," she said. "I'm Patricia. I've heard so much about you." I told her my name. I told her I was also the man whose name was on the title deed. She laughed politely, as if I'd made a small joke. She poured herself a coffee from my pot and sat down across from me at my kitchen table with the easy posture of someone who'd been doing it for weeks. I asked her how long she was planning to stay. She said she was looking around for something more permanent, but that the rental market on the coast was diabolical at the moment, and she really did appreciate the children helping her out. She used the word children, my daughter and her husband. Children. I asked her whether she had a deadline in mind. End of the month, perhaps, or end of the next. She said she wasn't really able to commit to anything specific just yet. I told her that by the end of the week, I would need her to commit to something specific. I told her I wasn't trying to be unkind, but that this was my home, that nobody had asked my permission, and that the situation as it stood was not one I was prepared to continue. She set her coffee cup down. She looked at me for a long moment with her head slightly tilted, the way a person does when they're recalculating. Then she said, in a much cooler voice than the one she'd been using, that she'd talk to her son about it. I said I'd appreciate that. The deadbolt had been removed from the study door overnight. Brennan had used a chisel rather poorly, and there was a long gouge in the doorframe that would need filling and repainting. Inside the study, things were worse than I'd let myself imagine. Eleanor's reading chair had been pushed into the corner and draped with what looked like a polyester throw rug to convert it into a luggage stand. There was an open suitcase on it. There were toiletries on the desk where I used to do the household accounts. The bookshelves had been partially cleared. My books stacked in piles on the floor, and the empty shelf space filled with what looked like Patricia's collection of romance novels and porcelain figurines. The framed photograph of Eleanor and me at Cradle Mountain in 1981, the autumn before our daughter was born, was lying face down on top of one of the book piles. The glass was cracked. I stood there for a long time with my hand on the doorframe. Then I went and got my mobile phone, and I rang my solicitor. Her name's Margaret Whitaker. She's been handling my affairs since Eleanor passed in 2015. She's about my age. No nonsense. Doesn't soften bad news. And she has the kind of memory that makes you grateful she's on your side. I explained the situation in detail. I told her about the timing. I told her about Patricia, about the lock, about the conversation with my daughter, about the photograph. Margaret asked a few questions. She told me what my legal position was. She explained that because Imogen and Brennan had been residing in the home for 3 and a bit years, with my consent, they had certain occupancy rights that needed to be respected through formal notice. Patricia, however, who had been residing there for less than a month, with no agreement, no rent paid, and no consent from me, was in a different category altogether. Margaret told me what to do. She told me to start documenting everything immediately. I took photographs. The gouged door frame. The dressing gown Patricia had taken from the linen cupboard. The cracked photograph. The contents of the garage where my books and files had been thrown. I wrote down dates. I wrote down the substance of the conversations I'd had with Brennan, with Imogen, with Patricia. Then I rang an old colleague of mine, a fellow who used to do property searches and background checks for the firm. I asked him whether he'd come across the name Brennan Cosgrove in any of his work, formerly of a freight forwarding company in Brisbane. He said he'd have a look and ring me back. He rang me back the following afternoon. He said yes. He'd found something. Brennan had been let go from that company 16 months before he and Imogen had moved in with me. The reason wasn't, as Imogen had told me at the time, a corporate restructure. He'd been dismissed following an internal investigation into a number of customer accounts where there were discrepancies in the invoicing. No charges were ever laid. These things often aren't, when a company would rather quietly part ways than deal with the publicity. But the amount involved was, my colleague said, in the high 5 figures. I sat with that information for the better part of a day. I should say at this point that I'm not telling you any of this to paint Brennan as a monster. People do desperate things when they're frightened or out of their depth. I'm telling you because it mattered. Because I'd had this man living in my house for 3¼ years. Because I'd lent my daughter money 4 times during that period. Once, for what she said was a car repair. Once for what she said was a vet bill for their dog. Twice for what she described as bridging finance during gaps in Brennan's employment. The total of those 4 loans came to just over $22,000. None of it had been repaid. I hadn't pressed for it. Because she was my daughter. And you want to believe your daughter when she tells you things are going to come right. That evening, I asked Imogen to come and sit with me on the back veranda. We sat in the cane chairs that overlooked Eleanor's herb garden, and I watched my daughter for a while before I spoke. She looked tired in a way I had been mistaking, for several years, for the ordinary tiredness of adult life. That afternoon, I saw it for what it was, the tiredness of someone who's been carrying a secret for a very long time. I asked her about Brennan's dismissal. The real story. She looked out at the garden. After a long pause, she told me. Not all of it, but enough. She confirmed the dismissal. She confirmed the nature of the discrepancies. She said they'd been paying down debts ever since, and that things had been harder than she'd let on. I asked her where the $22,000 had gone. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said most of it had gone to pay back what Brennan had taken. The company had agreed not to pursue charges if the money was returned in full within 24 months. They'd been making payments. I nodded. I let that sit between us for a while. Then I told her that I loved her, and that wasn't going to change. I told her, however, that I needed her and Brennan to find another place to live. I told her I'd give them 90 days written notice, properly drawn up by Margaret, and that I was prepared to help with bond money for a rental if they were stretched. I told her that Patricia, who had no agreement with me whatsoever, would need to be out within a fortnight, I told her I wasn't doing this to punish anyone. I was doing it because the alternative was to keep pretending that things were one way when in fact they were another, and I'd done enough of that pretending in the last 3 years to last me the rest of my life. She cried again. This time, I didn't reach for her hand. I let her cry, and I sat with her. And after a while, she wiped her eyes and said she understood. I spoke to Brennan the next morning at the kitchen table. I told him what I knew. I didn't dress it up. He didn't try to deny much. He said he'd been planning to tell me in his own time. I said the time for that had been 3 years ago, when he first walked through my front door with a suitcase and accepted my hospitality. I told him that I expected him to behave decently towards Imogen during whatever came next, and that I would be watching to make sure he did. He said he would. I half believed him. I spoke to Patricia last. I told her she had 14 days. I told her I was prepared to give her a list of community housing options on the Sunshine Coast and contact details for a service that helps older renters find affordable accommodation. I told her I bore her no ill will personally. She wasn't responsible for the choices her son had made. She took the printout I'd prepared, without thanking me, and she went upstairs. She left 10 days later, with a woman I assumed was a friend, driving a small hatchback. She didn't say goodbye to me. She did, I noticed afterwards, take Eleanor's dressing gown with her. I let it go. Some things aren't worth chasing. Imogen and Brennan moved out 43 days into the 90-day notice period, having found a unit in Carindale that they could just about afford. I won't go into the details of what happened between them after that, because it's their story rather than mine. I'll only say that the marriage ended about 8 months later, that Imogen now lives with our old family dog and a flatmate in a townhouse in Holland Park, and that we have dinner together once a fortnight at a little Italian place in Camp Hill that her mother used to love. She's been seeing a counselor. She told me, about a year after everything, that she'd known what Brennan had done from the start, and that she'd been ashamed of herself for keeping it from me, and that the shame had grown harder to face the longer she'd left it. She apologized. I told her I forgave her, which was true, and that forgiveness wasn't quite the same thing as forgetting, which was also true. Margaret revised my will in the spring. Imogen is still in it. Not the whole of it, the way she would have been before, but a fair portion. The rest goes to Hazel, to a couple of charities Eleanor cared about, and into a small trust for any grandchildren that might come along, should Imogen find her way to that someday. I told Imogen what I'd done, and why, and she said she understood, and I think she did. I put the study back together myself, slowly, over the course of about 3 weeks while my hip was still healing. I brought Eleanor's chair up from where they'd shoved it, and I sat in it for a long time before I moved anything else back into the room. The afternoon light came through the window the way it always had. The jacaranda was past its bloom by then, but the kookaburras had come back to the gum trees out the back, and they were carrying on something fierce, the way they ought to. I want to say a few things to anyone watching this who finds themselves in something like the situation I was in. Firstly, your home is your home. It doesn't matter how much you love your children. It doesn't matter how grateful you are that they want to be near you. The deeds are in your name, and the decisions about who lives under that roof are yours to make. Anyone who tells you otherwise, even somebody you raised, is not respecting you the way you deserve. Secondly, kindness without limits is not kindness. It's something else. It's a slow erosion, and the people who benefit from it usually know exactly what they're doing. When you set a boundary, you're not being cruel. You're teaching the people around you what's acceptable and what isn't. That's one of the most important things an older person can do for the younger people in their life, even when those younger people don't see it that way at the time. Thirdly, document everything. I know that sounds cold, but it isn't. It's protective. It protects you. and it protects the relationships that matter. Because facts on paper are harder to argue about than feelings remembered differently by different people. And lastly, forgive when you can. But don't confuse forgiveness with going back to the way things were. The way things were is what got you into the trouble in the first place. Things have to be different on the other side of something like this, or the lesson hasn't been learned, and the people you love most won't grow into the better versions of themselves they're capable of being. I sit out on the veranda most afternoons now with a cup of tea, and I look out over Eleanor's herb garden and I listen to the birds. The house is quiet again, in the way that I like. My sister Hazel comes to stay 1 weekend a month. My daughter rings me on Sunday evenings. My hip is good as new, the surgeon tells me, which is a small miracle, considering I'm 70 years old this October. I came home from hospital expecting to find the same house I'd left 19 days earlier. What I found was a problem I'd been refusing to look at for 3 years, finally laid out in front of me where I couldn't pretend not to see it. I don't thank Patricia and her son for that exactly, but I'll admit the lesson came at the right time. Some things you only learn by having them taken from you, even if only for an afternoon. Look after the people you love, but look after yourself first. Because if you don't, there'll come a day when you can't look after either, and that's a much harder hole to climb out of than the one I found myself in that Tuesday afternoon when I came home from the hospital and found my study door locked.